Rising star in San Antonio's hip-hop scene.
He was following in the footsteps of his cousin Beyonce.
He wanted to make a name for himself.
And with his ride or die by his side, it seemed like the sky was the limit.
She was there with him every step of the way.
Their love needed them to be together.
Until his music career started taking center stage.
He meets a new woman in the San Antonio music scene.
Their creative relationship blossomed into something more personal.
So when he's found dead, who is to blame?
This was not an accident that took his life.
The evidence points to a chilling crime committed by a killer with a grudge.
There's a power and control dynamic that's at play.
He's not responding, and I don't know what's going on.
Don't believe anything she's saying.
She was lying about the altercation.
Her last boyfriend had ended up dead.
She should have come with a warning label.
6th, 2021, San Antonio, Texas, a once quiet mission town, has grown into the Lone Star State's second largest city.
San Antonio has somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 million residents. It is one of the fastest growing cities in the country.
San Antonio, for being a large city, really has a small town feel. It's very traditional, very old, and that makes it different than the other large cities in Texas.
But around 12 p.m., the city's calm is shaken when a 911 call reaches the San Antonio Police Department.
The woman said her name was Nina Edwards, and she lived out of state in Louisiana.
I'd like to report a missing person.
The caller tells police that she's concerned about her stepson, who is a 34-year-old up-and-coming rapper by the name of Martell DeRowan.
Martell lived in an apartment on the north side of San Antonio.
She tells police that they've tried to reach Martell for the last few days, and they are very concerned. They have not been able to reach him.
The last time we spoke to him was Friday.
She said nobody's heard from him, nobody's able to get a hold of him. Here's his address. Will you please go do a welfare check to make sure he's okay?
We're really worried about him.
When police arrive at Martell's apartment, there's immediate cause for concern.
There was a hole in the door near the peephole. Their concern at that point was that it was a bullet hole. So they contacted the management and asked if maintenance could assist them with gaining entry into the apartment.
Sir! Sir!
Inside the apartment, the officers make a tragic discovery.
As soon as they opened the door, they just saw a victim laying on the floor.
Martell was lying in a pool of blood.
Despite his reserved personality, 34-year-old Martell DeRowan had a powerful presence that caught people's attention the moment they met him.
Martell was always separated from his peers by his quiet thoughtfulness that you noticed about him.
There was a quiet strength that always seemed to set him aside.
He was young, talented, intelligent, handsome, just a very, very impressive young man.
One of the most important people in Martell's life was his high school sweetheart, Gwen Anderson.
She was from his hometown of New Iberia, Louisiana.
They really connected with each other from a young age and got an apartment in San Antonio.
Their love needed them to be together.
So when Martell decided to join the military in 2004, Gwen didn't shy away.
He wanted to start a career and see the world, and that desire led him to join the military.
He enlists in the Air Force.
He was attached to an esteemed intelligence unit.
Martell was very intelligent. He had to have been to be selected to be into that career field.
However, after 6 years of service in the military, Martell decided it was time for a change.
After reaching the rank of sergeant, Martell left the Air Force and refocused his passions towards his love of music.
Martell always dabbled in music, but that was his hobby, that was his sideline.
At 34 years old, It soon became his main focus in life.
Martell was very, very talented, and he comes from a musical family.
Martell and Beyonce are cousins. They share the same maternal grandmother that she named her clothing line after, House of Darion.
Martell began to make a name for himself in his own right in the music world.
And soon, he started to gain a following of his own.
In 2016, under the name Cardone, Martell released his first album.
Over the next few years, he released his 2 other singles under the name of Cardone.
In 2019, Martell was signed by the Sony-affiliated music label, The Orchard. His hip-hop career began to take off.
But while Martell's music career was taking off, his relationship with Gwen was falling apart.
Once the decision was made for him to leave the military and now make his hobby his profession, that caused some problems.
I'm not okay with all these damn groupies trying to get with you.
She was ready to settle down and start a family, and Martell was on a completely different page. He was just getting started in his music career.
I need you to support me.
The couple's differences proved irreconcilable. And after 13 years together, they made the difficult decision to part ways.
They remained very close friends and stayed in touch with each other over the years, but they ceased being a couple.
And so he poured himself into his music, finding solace in creativity.
Through his creative outlets, Martell eventually connected with someone new.
Before long, he meets a new woman in the San Antonio music scene by the name of Sasha Scar.
Martell and Sasha hit it off very quickly.
Like Martell, Sasha was an up-and-coming young talent in the world of hip-hop.
All right, let's do it one more time. I'm gonna bring the bass up a little bit.
They met filming a video for one of Martell's songs, and he recognized that Sasha had some talent.
And in 2019, Martell helped produce Sasha's first new single.
Yo, that's perfect.
Their creative relationship blossomed into something more personal, and they began dating.
Thank you, baby.
Together, they seemed like an unstoppable musical force.
In San Antonio, Martell was already a hot commodity. And then once he started this personal relationship with Sasha, they became like the it couple in the hip hop scene.
They were young and beautiful. Their careers were taking off.
It seemed like nothing could stop them.
But now, Martell's soaring career has come crashing down when San Antonio police officers find him unresponsive on the floor of his apartment.
When the officers were able to gain entry into the apartment, the first thing they see is Martell DeRuin.
He was lying in a pool of blood.
Police attempt to provide first aid, but realize they're too late.
Martell's body is cold to the touch.
It was clear that he had been dead for some time.
It's also clear how Martell died.
This was not an accident that took his life.
It was pretty obvious that the victim had a gunshot wound to the head.
When homicide detectives arrive at Martell's apartment, they begin trying to piece together what happened.
The apartment's in disarray. Some furniture is overturned. I noticed things broken on the floor. There's dishes broken, glass broken.
There are signs of a struggle.
A struggle which carried over into Martell's bedroom.
Going back into the bedroom, I noticed that the bed is actually broken, framed from the headboard. It looked to me like there had been a pretty serious physical fight in the apartment. Something bad happened in there.
Investigators also spot an important clue inside the bedroom closet.
In the closet, they find an open container which has a 9mm magazine in it.
The gun was gone. We couldn't find it anywhere in the apartment. That was a concern.
And they wonder if this is the weapon that killed Martell.
But if Martell's killer was inside his apartment, Why was he shot from outside his front door?
The only thing we found was a single gunshot through the door.
It was just odd.
By January of 2021, former Air Force intelligence specialist Martel DeRuin was making a name for himself on San Antonio's hip-hop circuit.
He was following in the footsteps of his cousin Beyonce.
Martel was also forging a relationship with another talented musician named Sasha Scar.
They were both young, they were both attractive, they were both talented.
But now, 4 days after Martel was last seen, police have found the young rapper dead on the floor of his apartment.
The victim had a gunshot wound to the head.
They made a determination pretty quickly, like, this looks like a homicide.
Detectives find clear signs of a struggle inside the apartment. So why does it appear Martel's killer shot him from outside the front door?
It appeared that he was shot while looking through the eye hole of the door of his own apartment. It was just odd that there was this violent interaction inside the apartment, and yet he was killed from the outside of the apartment.
Investigators quickly rule out robbery as a motive.
They find nothing missing in his apartment other than the handgun.
Martel's expensive music production equipment and cell phone are still in place.
There was no sign of forced entry, we knew that.
We knew that Mr. DeRuin was in the getting started in the entertainment industry, an aspiring rapper, musician. We thought about, could this be related to that?
Detectives hope that Martel's cell phone may lead them to a suspect.
The detectives turn over Martel's passcode-locked cell phone to forensic analysts for processing.
And in the meantime, they start making contact with his neighbors.
When we started the canvass, the first place we knocked was the neighbor's door right across from the victim's apartment.
The neighbor tells police that he heard commotion between 10:30 and 11 Friday night.
The neighbor said Friday night, they put in an order for fast food to have it delivered. And about the time the food should be delivered, they heard some pretty heavy knocking, beating on an apartment door.
Slamming on the door, hardcore, to the point where I thought it was on my door.
Thinking that was their food delivery, they got up and opened the door.
The neighbor says a young woman was standing outside.
She was like crying in front of the door, and I was like, hey, do you need something?
The young lady basically said, no, kind of in a don't worry about what I'm doing, mind your own business type thing.
When you saw her out there, was she carrying anything, holding anything?
No, not at all.
He didn't see her with any type of gun.
So he went back inside and tried to mind his own business.
And then maybe 20 minutes later, I heard it banging again, and just heard some arguing at the door, and then I'm not too sure because I stopped paying attention at that point. I just turned up the volume and tried to zone it out.
He didn't want to get involved.
Detectives aren't exactly sure how yet, but they believe this mystery woman had something to do with Martel's death.
We've now established that this critical incident happened on Friday night, which would explain why the family did not hear from the victim throughout the weekend.
Down the hall from Martel's apartment, detectives discover another potential lead.
They notice an apartment that has a video doorbell on the outside.
The resident of that apartment unit didn't seem to be home.
The police knock but get no answer, so they leave a business card on the front door, asking the resident to please contact them so they may download any possible video evidence.
After completing their canvass, investigators are about to head back to the station. But before they leave, they're approached by a young woman who says she needs to speak to them.
They said, okay, who are you? And she said, I'm Gwen Anderson.
She was concerned. Can you tell me what's going on? Have you found him? Is he okay?
Gwen explains that she's Martel's ex-girlfriend, and even though they'd broken up a couple of years earlier, they'd remained close.
They were separated, but they still communicated.
She tells the police the last time she had heard from Martel was around 1:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon.
She hadn't been able to reach him in several days, so she figured she'd come and check in person.
Detectives are immediately suspicious of Gwen's story.
The fact that they had been broken up for so long and she was still showing up to his apartment, it just didn't seem right.
At this time, we didn't know who was involved, and it wouldn't be far-fetched to believe that there was some kind of dispute between her and the man she was separated from.
Could Gwen be the same woman Martel's neighbor saw outside his apartment around the time of the murder?
Knowing that the neighbor across from the victim's apartment had seen this female banging on a door, we really wanted to talk to Miss Anderson and get as much information from her as possible.
But when detectives inform Gwen that Martel is dead, she breaks down in tears.
She became so upset that they weren't really even able to continue interviewing her at the scene.
Detectives tell her to take her time, compose herself, and they'll schedule a time to speak with her at the station.
After returning to police headquarters, investigators continue poring over the case.
Check out this report from Friday night.
Police uncovered that a 911 call was placed at the apartment complex around the same time that Martel was killed.
San Antonio 911, do you need police, fire, or EMS?
I need police now.
The caller said she was afraid her ex-boyfriend had been injured.
She's standing outside, is unable to reach him, and can't get inside.
Do you hear him?
No, he's not responding. There's a hole in his door, and I don't know what's going on.
There's a hole in the door?
Yes.
And you don't have a key?
No, ma'am, I don't.
But it's what the caller says next that sends alarm bells ringing.
Okay, and your name?
She says, "My name is Gwen Anderson."
Detectives investigating the murder of San Antonio rapper Martel DeRuin have just learned that a woman claiming to be his ex-girlfriend made a 911 call on the night he was killed.
I need police now.
Okay, and your name?
She says, "My name is Gwen Anderson."
She claimed that she needed to have someone check in an apartment because she thought he might be hurt.
He's not responding, and there's a hole in his door, and I don't know what's going on.
But according to the report, police eventually chalked it up to a prank call.
She hangs up and refuses to pick up any of the attempts by the 911 operator to call her back.
When officers responded to that apartment complex, she was gone, nowhere to be found, so they weren't able to even check on Martel that night, which is why he was not found until that following Tuesday.
If Gwen had made the 911 call from that night, why didn't she mention it earlier?
That was very, very suspicious to the detectives.
The police are suspicious as to why Gwen Anderson failed to mention any of this. Was she trying to hide something?
But when investigators bring Gwen in to ask her about the phone call, she seems puzzled.
The detectives confronted Gwen Anderson with that information. She was very confused. She had no idea what they were talking about.
Gwen tells the detectives she did not make a 911 call.
You're telling us this is not you?
San Antonio 911, do you need police, fire, or EMS?
I need police now.
And she said, "That is not me. That is not me who made that phone call." Gwen reiterated several times that there was no way that she could ever do anything to harm Martel.
Gwen admits that their relationship wasn't perfect, even before the breakup.
She tells them that, yes, there were problems in their relationship.
He was suffering from PTSD as a result of his military service. She admits that they did have arguments that turned physical.
But Gwen says they always found their way back to each other after some time apart.
But she says she was still in love with him.
She knew him inside and out. She knew that he was struggling with some mental health issues, and that didn't change the way she felt about him. They were young love. They grew up together. I think Gwen always thought that somewhere down the line there would be an opportunity for the two of them to get back together again because they were soulmates.
But is Gwen telling the truth?
The number that made the 911 call was registered to a burner phone. So at this point, they couldn't confirm or deny that Gwen made the call.
Is there anybody who can verify your whereabouts on Friday night?
No, I was at home by myself.
Detectives was suspicious of her story, but they didn't have enough evidence to keep her in custody.
However, before cutting her loose, police asked Gwen about what else was going on in Martel's life.
They asked her, do you know of any other woman that Martel has been dating lately?
He had told her that he was dating a young lady by the name of Sasha.
Her full name is Sasha Scar.
Gwen says, based on what Martel told her, he and Sasha were having serious issues in their relationship.
Martel would share with her the fact that this relationship with Sasha was pretty stressful. They would fight and argue quite a bit. And I think he even mentioned to her before that he was wanting to get out of that relationship.
At that point, detectives shift their attention to Martel's new girlfriend, Sasha.
And when detectives plug Sasha's name into their police database, they make an alarming discovery.
Miss Sasha is out on bond.
She was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
Her last boyfriend had ended up dead.
After speaking with Martel DeRuin's ex-girlfriend, Gwen Anderson, San Antonio detectives have a new suspect in his murder, his current girlfriend and music protege, Sasha Scar.
According to Gwen, Sasha and Martel had a pretty tumultuous relationship that he was trying to get out of.
Now police records have revealed this isn't Sasha's first brush with the law.
Detectives start delving into Miss Sasha's past, and they find some very disturbing information.
In 2019, Sasha was charged in connection to the homicide of her last boyfriend.
Sasha's then boyfriend had been shot and killed, and another man had been seriously injured.
21 years old, and she's been involved in the death of 2 of her boyfriends.
The incident report states that on November 29, 2019, Austin police officers responded to reports of a shooting near a local parking lot.
When they arrived, police discovered Sasha Scar alongside her 21-year-old boyfriend, Andrew Bass, who was suffering from a gunshot wound to the chest.
Paramedics attempted to perform CPR on Andrew, but it was too late.
He was ultimately pronounced dead at the scene.
Moments later, law enforcement received another call for help.
While police are with Sasha and Andrew, another 911 call comes in from a nearby liquor store. The caller says another man has come in with gunshot wounds to his leg and to his chest.
While the second victim was rushed to the hospital, police questioned Sasha.
Sasha told police that she had gone with Andrew to buy marijuana from a man she did not know.
I was just sitting in the car, and then I heard gunshots.
When she runs to see what is going on, she finds Andrew wrestling with another man. She said Andrew told her to grab the gun and the bag of marijuana.
This other guy ran off and...
During her interview, Sasha was adamant that the drug deal was set up by her boyfriend.
I didn't know any of this was gonna happen.
She said she was just tagging along.
But when police interviewed the other man who'd been shot, Phil Smith, they heard a very different story.
Don't believe anything she's saying.
He said, no, this is what happened. I'm friends with Sasha. Here's my phone. See, she set up a drug buy. She showed up with another male. They tried to rob me.
He said Sasha was in on the whole thing from the beginning.
Empty your pockets, Phil.
Realizing that he was being robbed, the man grabbed his own gun, and the two men exchanged shots.
They end up wrestling on the ground.
Sasha eventually grabbed Phil's gun and he ran to the liquor store for help.
When police investigate further, they discover the evidence lines up with Phil's version of events.
Sasha was lying about the altercation.
It was definitely a planned robbery and attack on this young man.
Ultimately, she was convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, a first-degree felony.
Then, in January 2020, 1 year before Martel was killed, she was released on bond.
We knew there that she definitely had a propensity for violence, so we wanted to make sure that we tracked her down.
And when detectives look through Sasha's recent addresses, they make a surprising connection.
We found out that she used to live on O'Connor Road here in San Antonio.
O'Connor Road. That sounds familiar.
That call on Friday night to 911, the caller initially gave the street name as being on O'Connor Road and then stopped herself.
It's 16735 O'Connor Road, not O'Connor, La Cantera Parkway.
Did Sasha Scar make the 911 call from Martel's apartment, posing as Gwen Anderson?
Now I'm starting to put it together.
But tracking down their new prime suspect will be easier said than done.
We had to find Sasha Scar. The family was really digging in. They knew it was important to find her, and it was difficult. We didn't know where she was.
The police can't find her anywhere.
Sasha is not answering the phone. When police visit her previous address, they find out that she no longer lives there.
As patrol officers continue scouring the city for Sasha, detectives receive word that their forensic analyst has managed to unlock Martel's cell phone.
We did have Mr. DeRuin's cell phone, and we were able to pinpoint messages that were between him and Sasha on the night of January 22nd.
Looks like these came through at about the same time the neighbors heard that fight Friday night.
The texts give investigators a first-hand look at an argument that was spiraling out of control.
Martel was sending Sasha a long rant about how he caught her talking to another man and how disgraceful he found her behavior to be.
The text messages also point to a physical altercation between the couple that night.
He said, yes, you attacked me, I defended myself.
Martel wrote, "You attacked me, all because I asked you to leave."
Shortly thereafter, he said, you should be locked up in jail for the rest of your life. That's where you belong.
It sounded as if Martel was kicking Sasha out and ending their relationship.
The messages prove Sasha was in a heated dispute with Martel on the night he was killed, but it's still no smoking gun.
Police have no airtight evidence that Sasha fired the shot that took Martel's life.
The evidence is still circumstantial.
Until detectives get a call from a new witness.
San Antonio Homicide Unit.
Investigators receive a call from one of Martel's neighbors, the man who has a doorbell camera installed at his apartment.
This person did allow us to look at it.
On the video, they see Sasha Scar walking in front of Martel's apartment with a gun in her hand.
That just blew this whole case wide open.
After discovering heated texts between Martel DeRuin and his girlfriend Sasha Scar from the night he was killed, San Antonio police have zeroed in on the 21-year-old rapper as their prime suspect.
Mr. DeRuin was texting her, and it obviously led to this big fight.
It became crystal clear that a physical altercation did occur inside the home.
And thanks to newly obtained ring footage from one of Martel's neighbors, police now have their smoking gun.
The Ring video camera, the value of that evidence in this case cannot be understated.
We were able to see that on the footage, she was carrying a cell phone in her left hand and a handgun in her right hand.
Investigators are stunned by the video, not only about how concrete and undeniable this piece of evidence is, but also how nonchalant Sasha appears, walking with this gun in her hand and texting on her cell phone.
On the recording, investigators can even hear Sasha placing the 911 call San Antonio police received on the night Martel died.
We actually heard her make the 911 call, where she even claims to be Ms. Anderson.
I'm trying to get in my apartment, but I'm not able to get in.
She was trying to frame Martel's ex, Gwen, for committing this crime.
As far as detectives are concerned, this is just undeniable proof that Sasha shot Martel.
Once we were confident that she is our suspect, we obtained an arrest warrant fairly quick.
But there's one problem. Investigators still have no idea where Sasha is.
The manhunt's on. We're looking for Sasha. We've got to find her.
When detectives try to trace Sasha's cell phone, they determined that the device had been switched off.
So we asked for help from the Marshal Service to track her down.
Meanwhile, detectives start reaching out to the people who know Sasha best.
We did have some people come forward, actual friends of Sasha, one claiming that she called him, he came and picked her up. We believe that was on the night of the 22nd.
She contacted me 2 days before and was trying to come out here to Houston. He was very adamant about coming out here.
He gave us locations where he took her. It really wasn't helping too much at that time because she was still on the move.
Other friends say they've been trying to persuade Sasha to do the right thing.
Friends were coming forward saying they were trying to contact her and they were trying to convince her to turn herself in.
I keep calling her and it's going straight to voicemail. I can call her right now while you're on the phone and it's going to go straight to voicemail.
Finally, on February 6th, more than 2 weeks after Martel was killed, San Antonio police get the news they've been waiting for.
They receive word that Sasha has surrendered herself.
Instead of taking the chance of being apprehended when she was least expecting it, she decided to turn herself in.
When I found out that she had turned herself in, my thought was she'd be willing to talk. She'd be willing to explain to me what happened on that Friday night with Martel. I go to the jail to meet with her in hopes that she'll provide a statement. I advise her of her rights and tell her why I'm there.
Okay, tell me what happened, Sasha.
But Sasha doesn't say a word.
She refuses to answer any questions.
She won't give a statement. She decides she doesn't want to talk to me, and she asks for an attorney.
This is your chance to come clean.
Give me a lawyer.
Okay, if that's what you want.
Yet even without a confession, investigators feel confident in the case they've built.
They charged Sasha with murder.
From there, it's my job now to put everything together and to present it to the district attorney's office. The family wanted justice for Martel. That's what we needed to focus on next.
When Sasha's trial begins in August 2023, everyone finally gets the chance to hear her side of the story.
Sasha took the witness stand during her murder trial. That doesn't happen very often, so I was kind of surprised that she did.
What she has to say leaves the whole courtroom speechless.
According to Sasha, Martel's death was not a murder.
She never intended to kill Martel.
She says it was a terrible accident.
In August of 2023, 23-year-old Sasha Scar is standing trial for the murder of her rapper boyfriend, Martel DeRuin.
Getting the evidence that we got was just, it was amazing. Rarely do we get video footage immediately after a crime where we've got the suspect carrying a murder weapon.
But once she takes the stand in her own defense, Sasha makes a brazen claim.
Sasha said she never intended to kill Martel.
According to Sasha, Martel's death wasn't murder. It was a terrible accident.
Sasha tells the court that the night of January 22nd started out like any other.
Sasha says that they were having a good time that night, until she answered a FaceTime call from a man who wanted to discuss a music venture with her.
Hey, what's up?
Who is that?
He's just interested in my music.
According to Sasha, that call set Martel off.
She tried to just brush the conversation off and just go to bed, but Martel was too upset. He wasn't having it.
I can't believe you talked to another man while you're in my apartment.
It's not even like that.
Sasha says the argument escalated to a physical fight on the bed.
She says he just jumped on her and attacked her and started beating her.
Get off of me!
She said he was hitting me, choking me to the point that I couldn't breathe.
In the midst of the struggle, the bed frame broke and Martel was thrown to the ground. Sasha says she seized that opportunity to grab his gun from the closet.
She grabbed the gun and ran from the bedroom into the kitchen.
When Martel pursued her, Sasha says she began throwing glasses and dishes just to put distance between the two.
But she says Martel was relentless.
She said she'd fled out of the apartment. She said she was barefooted, she was frantic, she was trying to call someone to come and get her.
After she was able to cool off for a few minutes, Sasha went back to the apartment to get her things, but found that the door was locked. She started yelling and banging on the door, telling Martel to let her in to get her things.
Martel, just give me my shoes and I'll be out of here.
Sasha says that's when the gun went off.
Martel!
She says she never intended to pull the trigger, but somehow, as she was banging the door, a shot was fired.
On the surface, Sasha's story seems plausible enough. But according to the prosecution, it's nothing but a pack of lies.
They contend that Martel's death was no accident.
They say that Sasha had every intention of killing Martel.
He tried to end things with her and lock her out of his apartment, but she wasn't having it.
Martel, open the door right now.
And once she heard Martel on the other side of the door, she raised the gun, shot through the door in a deliberate act of murder.
She wasn't there to get her things. She was there to kill him.
After just 2 short hours of deliberation, the jury reaches a decision.
They found Sasha guilty of murder.
In the state of Texas, we do not have different degrees of murder. It's just murder, and that's what Sasha was found guilty of.
Sasha Scar receives a sentence of 55 years behind bars.
It was just a big sigh of relief for me. Of course, there is that part of some sorrow for the family, but I was happy that they were able to get the justice that they deserved.
Even if justice has been served, Sasha Scar's violent actions can never be undone.
I really felt for Martel. This man was truly just an innocent victim to this situation.
Sasha had a lot of choices that night. She could have easily called the police and said, hey, there's been an altercation. Can you please come over here and stand by while I get my stuff?
Instead, she chose to take the life of a man who was on the verge of accomplishing great things.
Knowing what Sasha had done in the
In the winter of 1974, the city of Wichita, Kansas, still believed in ordinary mornings. Front porches welcomed the first pale light of day. Children hurried toward school carrying lunch boxes that swung carelessly at their sides. Neighbors recognized one another by the sound of familiar pickup trucks rolling down quiet streets before sunrise. Doors were sometimes left unlocked for a few extra minutes while someone carried groceries inside. Curtains remained open late into the evening, allowing warm yellow lamps to spill gentle light across front lawns. It was the kind of American community where routine felt stronger than fear, where people assumed tomorrow would look almost identical to yesterday. No one realized that someone else was studying those routines. Not from the shadows of a dark alley. Not from a speeding getaway car. But from inside the rhythm of everyday life itself. He blended into neighborhoods with remarkable ease. He understood the schedules of working parents, the silence that settled over suburban streets after school buses disappeared, and the tiny habits that people never imagined could matter. Which driveway emptied at 7:30 every morning? Which porch light stayed on until midnight? Which family adopted a new dog? Which window remained slightly open even during the coldest weeks of January? To everyone else, these details were forgettable. To him, they became maps. Years later, investigators would struggle to explain how a man could disappear into plain sight for decades. They would examine forensic evidence, psychological reports, stacks of interviews, and thousands of pages of investigative files. Experts would debate motivation. Journalists would analyze patterns. Criminal profilers would dissect his fantasies, his rituals, and his obsessive need for control. Yet none of those discussions could fully answer the question that haunted Wichita long after the arrests, the court hearings, and the headlines had faded. How could someone who appeared so painfully ordinary become one of America's most infamous serial killers? Because monsters, it turned out, rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they mow the lawn on Saturday afternoon. Sometimes they wave to neighbors across the fence. Sometimes they wear neatly pressed shirts, smile politely at church, and volunteer for community projects while carrying secrets that no one around them could begin to imagine. The story you are about to hear is not simply the story of a murderer. It is the story of invisible danger. It is the story of families whose ordinary mornings became the final chapter of their lives. It is the story of investigators chasing a ghost for more than 30 years. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is the story of a man who desperately wanted the world to know his name. He even created his own. BTK. 3 letters. Simple. Cold. Deliberately unforgettable. Bind. Torture. Kill. They were not labels invented by frightened newspapers or sensational television broadcasts. They were words chosen by the killer himself, reducing unimaginable human suffering into a signature, almost as though he believed his crimes deserved branding. Those 3 words would become synonymous with fear across Kansas, appearing on newspaper front pages, whispered during dinner conversations, and spoken quietly by parents checking the locks before putting their children to bed. But before the nickname. Before the letters. Before detectives assembled endless walls of photographs connected by strings and handwritten notes. There was only silence. A silence that settled over neighborhoods where nothing appeared unusual. A silence broken only after families failed to answer the telephone. A silence interrupted when someone noticed newspapers piling up untouched outside a front door. A silence that carried questions no one wanted to ask. For decades, America has become familiar with the stories of serial killers. Some hunted strangers across highways. Others targeted vulnerable victims hidden from public view. Many sought money, revenge, or personal gratification. Dennis Rader sought something different. Control. Absolute control. Not simply over life and death, but over anticipation, fear, attention, and memory. He did not merely want victims. He wanted ownership of their stories. He wanted investigators chasing him. He wanted newspapers printing his words. He wanted police officers opening envelopes that only he could have written. And when the attention disappeared, something inside him demanded that it return. Long before social media rewarded outrage with instant visibility, Dennis Rader understood a disturbing truth. Fear travels quickly. Attention lasts. Infamy can outlive the person who creates it. Yet if we focus only on his obsession, we risk forgetting the people whose lives were stolen long before America learned the initials BTK. Behind every headline stood parents waiting for children who never came home. Brothers and sisters searching for answers that never felt complete. Friends who replayed ordinary conversations over and over, wondering if there had been anything they should have noticed. Empty chairs at birthday celebrations. Bedrooms left untouched. Photographs that suddenly transformed into priceless memories. This story belongs to them first. Because serial killers often become infamous while victims slowly disappear beneath the weight of history. Names fade. Faces become statistics. Lives become footnotes. That is one of the quiet tragedies surrounding crimes like these. The murderer is remembered. The people he destroyed are sometimes forgotten. This story refuses to allow that. Every investigation begins somewhere. Sometimes with a fingerprint. Sometimes with a witness. Sometimes with a mistake. The BTK investigation began with confusion. Police officers responding to the earliest crime scenes encountered horrors unlike anything Wichita had experienced in recent memory. Detectives searched desperately for connections while trying to reassure an increasingly frightened public that everything possible was being done. But reassurance becomes difficult when investigators themselves have no clear answers. There was no obvious motive. No robbery explaining the violence. No personal dispute connecting every victim. Only fragments. Pieces. Patterns that appeared slowly, almost reluctantly, over years instead of weeks. Each new crime seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. Each passing year allowed the killer to become more confident. More patient. More calculating. He studied mistakes. He adapted. He waited. Patience became one of his greatest weapons. Unlike impulsive offenders driven entirely by opportunity, Dennis Rader demonstrated an unsettling willingness to postpone his fantasies until circumstances aligned with his expectations. If something disrupted his plans, he often walked away and returned another day. He observed neighborhoods repeatedly. He memorized routines. He rehearsed possibilities inside his own mind long before taking action. To investigators, this created an almost impossible opponent. He did not fit neatly into expectations. He disappeared for long periods. He resurfaced unexpectedly. He communicated when he wanted attention and vanished when pressure increased. Years stretched into decades. Children grew into adults. Police chiefs retired. Detectives handed files to younger investigators who inherited questions older than some members of the department. Entire careers became defined by the pursuit of a man whose face they did not know. Imagine opening a filing cabinet every morning and seeing the same photographs staring back at you. Imagine telling grieving families that the investigation remained active, while privately wondering whether the killer had died, moved away, or simply stopped. Imagine knowing that somewhere, someone possessed every answer you needed, yet continued living an apparently normal life. That possibility haunted Wichita. Every unfamiliar face became suspicious. Every rumor spread rapidly. Every anonymous phone call demanded attention. Communities changed. People locked doors that had remained open for generations. Women became more cautious walking alone. Parents warned children about strangers with renewed urgency. Trust became just a little more fragile. Fear rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it settles quietly into everyday behavior. A glance over one shoulder. An extra lock installed on the back door. A porch light left on until morning. A habit of checking windows twice before going to bed. Fear becomes routine. Routine becomes culture. And eventually, people forget exactly when life began feeling different. The BTK case reshaped Wichita in precisely that way. Not through constant violence. but through uncertainty. No one knew when he might strike again. No one knew whom he might choose. No one knew whether he was watching. Those unanswered questions proved almost as powerful as the crimes themselves. Yet perhaps the most disturbing chapter of this story had not even begun. Because Dennis Rader was never satisfied with simply escaping capture. He wanted recognition. He wanted conversation. He wanted investigators to think about him as often as he thought about himself. In many criminal cases, detectives searched desperately for suspects willing to speak. Here, the killer eventually volunteered. He wrote letters. He packaged clues. He inserted himself directly into the investigation. He transformed murder into communication. Every message became another psychological contest between himself and law enforcement. He believed he understood the game better than anyone pursuing him. For a long time, he appeared to be right. He watched years pass without handcuffs. Technology evolved around him. DNA science advanced. Computers became common inside American homes. The internet connected millions of people. Still, he remained free. Confidence slowly replaced caution. And confidence has a peculiar habit of convincing intelligent people that they are untouchable. Many infamous criminal investigations end because of extraordinary detective work. Others end because offenders make one devastating mistake. The BTK case would ultimately become both. But that ending remained decades away. At the beginning of our story, no one knew how many lives would be shattered. No one knew that children would grow into adults still waiting for justice. No one knew that a simple piece of aging computer technology would eventually accomplish what thousands of investigative hours could not. Those revelations belonged to the future. For now, Wichita remained a city standing unknowingly on the edge of history. A winter breeze drifted through quiet residential streets. Families prepared breakfast. Coffee brewed in kitchens. Cars warmed in driveways beneath pale January skies. The world looked perfectly ordinary. And somewhere nearby, a man who appeared just as ordinary was preparing to begin a nightmare that would cast its shadow across more than 3 decades, challenge generations of investigators, and leave an entire community asking the same impossible question long after justice was finally served. How well do we really know the people living next door? The city of Wichita in the early 1970s was not the kind of place that expected to become part of criminal history. It was a growing Midwestern community built on routine, hard work, and the quiet confidence that comes from familiarity. Wide residential streets stretched between modest single-family homes where bicycles rested carelessly on front lawns and children spent long afternoons chasing one another through neighborhoods until porch lights signaled that it was time to come inside. Churches stood at the center of many communities, not only as places of worship but as gathering spaces where birthdays were celebrated, meals were shared, and families marked the passing of every important season together. People recognized grocery store cashiers by name. Mechanics remembered the cars they serviced. Teachers often knew the parents of every child sitting in their classrooms. Wichita was not perfect, but it was predictable, and for many people, predictability felt almost identical to safety. Kansas itself seemed to reinforce that feeling. Endless fields stretched toward distant horizons, interrupted only by grain elevators, water towers, and highways that disappeared into open skies. During winter, cold winds swept across the plains with little to slow them, rattling bare branches and pushing dry leaves across quiet sidewalks. Snow rarely transformed the city into a frozen postcard, but January carried a persistent chill that encouraged families to gather indoors after sunset. Warm kitchen lights glowed through living room windows while televisions flickered softly inside homes that looked remarkably similar from one block to the next. It was a landscape that appeared ordinary enough to escape national attention. For most Americans, Wichita existed somewhere between familiar and forgotten. It was a city where people built lives instead of headlines. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, life was changing. The United States had entered a decade filled with uncertainty. The optimism that had characterized much of the post-war era had begun to fade. The Vietnam War continued to divide public opinion. Political scandals were eroding confidence in institutions that many citizens had once trusted without hesitation. Rising crime rates in several major cities were becoming regular topics on the evening news. Across the country, Americans were beginning to lock their doors more often than they once had. Still, Wichita felt different. It remained insulated from much of the fear dominating larger metropolitan areas. Parents believed their children could safely walk to school. Neighbors exchanged spare house keys without much thought. Families planned futures measured not in years but in generations. Many expected to spend their entire lives in the same neighborhoods where they had grown up. It was a city that valued stability. And stability has a way of creating assumptions. People assume tomorrow will resemble today. They assume familiar faces are trustworthy. They assume terrible things happen somewhere else. Those assumptions would soon be tested. Among the thousands of ordinary residents living in Wichita was a man who rarely attracted attention. He did not possess the appearance that popular culture often associates with violent criminals. There were no dramatic warning signs visible to casual acquaintances. No public outbursts that forced neighbors to keep their distance. No mysterious disappearances that invited rumors. To many people who encountered him during different stages of his life, Dennis Lynn Rader appeared disciplined, polite, and remarkably conventional. He had served in the United States Air Force during the 1960s before eventually returning to Kansas. Like countless veterans of his generation, he sought the stability of civilian life. He married. He became a father. He worked regular jobs. Bills needed to be paid. Lawns needed to be mowed. Weekends were filled with the same ordinary responsibilities carried by millions of American families. From a distance, there was nothing remarkable about him. That ordinary appearance would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because evil does not always isolate itself from society. Sometimes it learns how to imitate it. Psychologists would later spend years examining Rader's personality, searching for explanations that might help make sense of his crimes. They described an individual who craved control, who carefully organized both his public image and his private fantasies, and who appeared capable of separating one identity from another with unsettling precision. While colleagues saw an employee, neighbors saw a familiar face, and fellow church members saw a man participating in community life, another version of Dennis Rader existed entirely beyond public view. That hidden identity was patient. It was methodical. It observed rather than rushed. Long before investigators learned his name, Rader had already begun constructing a world inside his own imagination. Fantasy occupied a central place in his thinking. Instead of remaining fleeting thoughts, those fantasies gradually evolved into elaborate mental rehearsals. They became structured, repeated, and increasingly connected to the desire for domination and control. Experts have cautioned against reducing his actions to any single psychological explanation, but many agree that his crimes reflected years of violent fantasy rather than sudden impulses. That distinction mattered. Impulsive violence often leaves chaos behind. Planned violence leaves patterns. The patterns simply take longer to recognize. Meanwhile, life continued uninterrupted for everyone else. Morning traffic flowed through downtown Wichita as office workers hurried toward their jobs. Aircraft manufacturing remained an important part of the local economy, providing employment for thousands of families whose daily routines revolved around factory shifts and dependable paychecks. Schools echoed with ordinary conversations about homework, basketball games, and weekend plans. Grocery stores stocked fresh produce while cashiers greeted familiar customers with practiced smiles. The rhythm of the city felt reassuring precisely because it changed so little from one day to the next. Routine creates comfort. It also creates predictability. Someone willing to study those routines could begin seeing opportunities invisible to everyone else. Imagine standing on a quiet suburban street during an ordinary weekday morning. One garage door opens at exactly 7 o'clock. Another family leaves 15 minutes later. A school bus arrives at nearly the same time every afternoon. A woman waters plants every Saturday. An elderly couple walks their dog shortly before sunset. Most people would never notice these repetitions. Someone obsessed with planning would. Investigators would later discover that Dennis Rader often spent significant time watching potential victims before ever approaching them. He observed schedules, neighborhoods, and habits. He referred to these periods of surveillance in ways that suggested he viewed people less as individuals than as objectives requiring preparation. Every observation served a purpose. Every routine became another piece of information stored away until he believed the moment was right. The victims never knew they had entered someone else's plans. That is perhaps one of the most chilling realities surrounding cases like this. The danger begins long before the crime itself. It begins when an ordinary day becomes part of someone else's secret timeline. Wichita, however, knew nothing of these preparations. Parents continued attending school events. Children celebrated birthdays. Families gathered for Sunday dinners. Couples discussed mortgages, vacations, and future dreams. The city remained alive with ordinary hope. Hope has a quiet sound. It lives inside conversations about next summer. It appears in freshly painted bedrooms prepared for growing children. It exists in grocery lists taped to refrigerator doors and calendars filled with family appointments. The families who would later become connected to the BTK investigation were living those ordinary moments without the slightest awareness that history was already moving toward them. None of them imagined becoming symbols. None of them expected newspaper reporters on their front lawns. None of them believed investigators would one day memorize the layout of their homes. That is one of the cruelest truths about violent crime. It interrupts lives already in progress. Not dramatic lives. Simply ordinary ones. The homes scattered across Wichita reflected that simplicity. Living rooms displayed family photographs instead of expensive artwork. Children's drawings decorated refrigerator doors. Holiday decorations were carefully packed away after Christmas while parents returned to work and students settled back into school following winter break. Telephones rang with conversations about dinner plans. Television sets broadcast weather forecasts predicting another cold Kansas evening. Dogs barked as mail carriers moved from house to house delivering letters that contained nothing more extraordinary than utility bills and birthday cards. No one could distinguish one ordinary house from another. Certainly not by looking from the outside. Yet somewhere among those homes, someone was already imagining scenes no family should ever experience. History often encourages us to believe that major events arrive with warning signs. Most do not. The morning before a tragedy usually resembles every other morning. Coffee tastes the same. Children laugh the same way. Parents hurry through the same routines. The future gives no indication that it is about to divide itself into before and after. The people of Wichita were still living in the before. Law enforcement, too, reflected the era in which they worked. Investigative techniques available during the early 1970s were capable but limited by modern standards. DNA profiling did not yet exist as a practical forensic tool. Digital databases capable of connecting crimes across jurisdictions were decades away from becoming commonplace. Detectives depended heavily upon eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, interviews, neighborhood canvasses, and patient investigative work. Cases were solved through persistence, intuition, and cooperation rather than advanced technology. Few officers could have imagined that the investigation they were about to inherit would stretch across multiple generations. Some detectives would retire before seeing its conclusion. Others would spend significant portions of their careers pursuing a suspect whose identity remained hidden behind layers of ordinary respectability. The investigation had not yet begun. The letters had not yet arrived. The initials BTK had not yet entered America's vocabulary. All of that still belonged to the future. For now, Wichita remained suspended in one final season of innocence, unaware that its name would soon become permanently linked with one of the longest and most haunting serial murder investigations in American history. Somewhere within the city's familiar neighborhoods, beneath the appearance of ordinary life, two very different stories were moving toward the same inevitable intersection. One belonged to families planning nothing more extraordinary than tomorrow. The other belonged to a man whose private fantasies had been quietly growing for years, waiting for the moment when imagination would give way to action. The names that would eventually become known across America were never meant to be remembered because of tragedy. They belonged to ordinary people whose greatest ambitions had little to do with history. They dreamed about birthdays that had not yet arrived, school years still waiting to begin, family vacations postponed until summer, and the thousands of small moments that quietly shape a lifetime. Before investigators memorized their names and reporters printed them beneath dark headlines, they were simply parents, children, neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and friends. They laughed around dinner tables. They worried about bills. They celebrated holidays. They planned for futures they believed were still safely ahead of them. The first family forever connected to the BTK investigation lived in a modest home on North Edgemoor Street in Wichita. There was nothing extraordinary about the neighborhood. It looked much like countless others scattered throughout the city, lined with simple houses, trimmed lawns, driveways filled with family cars, and sidewalks where children rode bicycles after school. During the winter months, the trees stood bare against pale Kansas skies, while cold winds swept through the quiet streets, carrying little more than the familiar sounds of everyday suburban life. Inside one of those homes lived the Otero family. Joseph Otero was 38 years old, a husband, a father, and a man whose life revolved around providing for the people he loved. Friends and family remembered him as hardworking and dependable. Like many parents, much of his energy was spent balancing responsibilities that rarely made headlines but defined a person's character all the same. Long hours at work were followed by evenings devoted to family life. There were bills to pay, repairs to make around the house, and children who depended on him for guidance. His life reflected the quiet determination shared by countless fathers who measured success not by recognition but by the well-being of those waiting for them at home. His wife, Julie Otero, was 34. Those who knew her described a woman devoted to her family, someone whose days were often organized around the needs of her children. Like so many mothers, much of her work remained invisible to the outside world. Meals appeared on the table because someone had planned them. Clothes were folded because someone had quietly finished the laundry. School schedules, appointments, birthdays, and ordinary family routines rarely managed themselves. Julie's care could be found in the countless small acts that often go unnoticed until they are suddenly absent. Together, Joseph and Julie were raising 4 children. Joseph Jr., only 9 years old, stood at an age when the world still seemed wonderfully uncomplicated. Childhood often exists within a rhythm that adults gradually forget. School days feel endless. Summers appear permanent. Every birthday promises new adventures just beyond the horizon. For children, tomorrow is assumed rather than questioned. The future stretches outward without limits because no one has yet taught them how fragile life can become. His older sister, Josephine, was 11. Family photographs captured the quiet confidence common to children standing on the edge of adolescence. She was growing into her own personality, balancing childhood innocence with the first hints of independence. Like so many girls her age, she was discovering new interests, new friendships, and new dreams that seemed far larger than the neighborhood where she lived. 2 older siblings, Charlie and Carmen, were not home on the morning that would forever alter their family history. Their absence that day would shape the rest of their lives in ways impossible to imagine. In later years, surviving family members would carry not only grief but also the enduring weight of memory, preserving stories about parents and siblings whose voices could no longer tell those stories themselves. Looking back through photographs of the Otero family, nothing appears unusual. There are smiles that resemble millions of family photographs taken across America during the early 1970s. Parents stand proudly beside their children. Young faces look toward the camera with expressions untouched by fear. The pictures freeze moments that seemed ordinary when they were taken but would later become irreplaceable pieces of remembrance. That is one of the quiet tragedies surrounding violent crime. A photograph changes after loss. What was once simply a family portrait becomes evidence of everything that was taken away. Friends remembered everyday conversations. Neighbors remembered brief greetings exchanged across front yards. Teachers remembered students sitting in classrooms only days before. Each memory became unexpectedly precious. When communities lose someone suddenly, ordinary details acquire extraordinary meaning. Someone remembers the last wave from a driveway. Someone else recalls a conversation in a grocery store. A coworker remembers laughing over coffee during a break. These fragments seem insignificant until they become the final memories people have to hold on to. The Otero family was not unique because of fame or wealth. They were unique because they represented thousands of American families living ordinary lives built upon love, responsibility, and hope. That ordinary quality made the loss resonate so deeply throughout Wichita. People saw themselves reflected in the family. Parents imagined their own children. Children imagined their own homes. Neighbors wondered whether something similar could happen anywhere. As investigators later learned more about the crimes connected to BTK, another heartbreaking pattern emerged. The victims shared no single profession, no common social circle, and no relationship with one another that could explain why they had been chosen. They were individuals living separate lives, connected only by the decisions of one offender. Catherine Bright was 21 years old in 1974. Those who knew her remembered a young woman standing at the beginning of adulthood, with hopes and plans that stretched far beyond the present moment. Friends described someone full of life, someone whose future remained unwritten. Like many young adults, she was navigating work, family, and the ordinary uncertainty that accompanies the transition into independent life. Shirley Vian was 24 years old, a young mother caring for children while balancing the responsibilities of daily family life. Her home was filled with the same routines shared by countless parents, preparing meals, cleaning, comforting children, and planning for tomorrow. The routines themselves were unremarkable. Their importance became clear only after they were interrupted forever. Nancy Fox worked hard, maintained friendships, and built a life that reflected independence and determination. Co-workers remembered reliability. Friends remembered conversations that seemed completely ordinary at the time. Like every victim connected to this case, she existed as a complete person long before she became associated with a criminal investigation. Maureen Hedge had served her country as well as her community through her work. Those closest to her remembered warmth, humor, and generosity rather than the headlines that would eventually overshadow her name. Vicki Wegel devoted herself to raising her family while building a home filled with everyday routines that parents everywhere would recognize. School activities, family dinners, errands, and responsibilities occupied far more of her attention than anything extraordinary. Dolores Davis, the final confirmed victim, was known among family and friends as someone whose life reflected kindness, independence, and strong personal relationships. Those who loved her remembered not the circumstances of her death but the countless years that came before it, years filled with celebrations, ordinary conversations, and quiet acts of generosity. When discussing serial murder, history sometimes compresses victims into lists. A name. An age. A date. Perhaps an occupation. Then the narrative moves forward. Real life does not work that way. Every victim leaves behind dozens of people whose own lives continue. Parents who outlive their children. Children who grow up without parents. Brothers and sisters who celebrate birthdays while silently counting absent family members. Friends who hesitate before deleting old voicemail messages because hearing a familiar voice suddenly feels priceless. Loss spreads outward like ripples across water. The immediate victim is never the only person affected. Entire communities absorb the shock. Schools notice empty desks. Churches notice missing families. Co-workers notice empty offices. Neighbors notice lights that no longer turn on each evening. Grief quietly rearranges the geography of everyday life. For the surviving members of the Otero family, healing would never mean forgetting. Instead, it meant preserving memories that existed long before newspaper headlines transformed their family into part of one of America's most infamous criminal cases. Interviews given years later reflected not only unimaginable sorrow but also determination that Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., and Josephine should be remembered for who they were rather than solely for what happened to them. That determination matters. True crime often risks allowing offenders to dominate the narrative. Names like BTK become widely recognized, while victims slowly disappear into historical footnotes. The reality should be the opposite. Without the lives that were stolen, there would be no case to discuss, no investigation to follow, and no lessons to learn. Every chapter of this story begins not with a killer but with people whose futures deserved the chance to unfold naturally. The children should have grown into adulthood. Parents should have watched graduations. Families should have gathered for birthdays that never came. Photographs should have continued filling albums year after year instead of becoming the final visual record of lives interrupted. As Wichita moved through the opening weeks of 1974, none of these families imagined they were standing at the edge of history. Their calendars remained filled with ordinary appointments. Work schedules continued unchanged. Children completed homework, argued over chores, and dreamed about weekends ahead. The city itself carried on with quiet confidence, unaware that the ordinary lives unfolding behind familiar front doors would soon become the center of an investigation that would challenge generations of detectives and forever alter how one American community understood the meaning of safety. January 15, 1974, began like countless other winter mornings in Wichita. The sky carried the muted gray of a Kansas January, with low clouds stretching across the horizon and cold air settling quietly over the neighborhoods before sunrise. Frost clung to patches of grass, and the streets were still damp from the freezing temperatures of the night before. Cars slowly emerged from driveways as engines warmed against the cold. School buses followed their familiar routes, stopping at corners where children bundled in heavy coats waited with backpacks resting at their feet. Nothing about the morning suggested that it would become one of the darkest days in the city's history. Inside homes across Wichita, ordinary routines unfolded without interruption. Coffee brewed in kitchens. Radios delivered weather forecasts and local news. Parents reminded children not to forget their lunches. Office workers glanced at their watches before heading out the door, already thinking about meetings, errands, and the quiet responsibilities that filled every weekday. The Otero family had every reason to believe their day would be just as ordinary. Like so many families, their lives were built around routine. There were school schedules to follow, work responsibilities to manage, and countless small tasks that made up everyday life. The previous weeks had been filled with the lingering atmosphere of the holiday season. Christmas decorations had already been packed away, children had returned to school after winter break, and the new year still carried the quiet optimism that accompanies fresh beginnings. No one could have imagined that before the day was over, that sense of normalcy would be shattered. As the morning progressed, subtle signs began to appear that something was not quite right. A phone call went unanswered. Then another. At first, there was no reason to panic. Families missed calls all the time. Someone might have stepped outside. A parent could have been running errands. Children might already have left for school. Life often interrupted simple communication, and most unanswered telephones had perfectly ordinary explanations. Hours passed. Concern slowly replaced assumption. People who knew the family began noticing small inconsistencies. The routines they had come to expect no longer seemed to fit together. Something felt out of place, although no one could yet explain exactly what that feeling meant. It is often said that tragedy announces itself with dramatic warning signs. In reality, it usually begins with quiet uncertainty. Someone says, "That's strange." Another replies, "I'm sure everything is fine." Those simple reassurances grow weaker as minutes become hours. By midday, the uneasiness surrounding the Otero home had become impossible to ignore. Concerned individuals eventually went to check on the family in person. The house stood where it always had, unchanged from the outside. The front yard revealed nothing unusual. The surrounding neighborhood remained calm. Nearby homes continued with their ordinary routines. Children played elsewhere. Cars passed along nearby streets. The world outside continued moving forward, unaware that one household had fallen into silence. When the truth was finally discovered, that ordinary neighborhood was transformed forever. The people who entered the home that day were confronted with a reality almost impossible to comprehend. The scene immediately made clear that this was not an accident or a medical emergency. Authorities were contacted without delay, and within a short time, police officers, investigators, and emergency personnel arrived at the residence. Word spread quickly. Police cars gathered outside the home. Neighbors stepped onto porches, unsure of what had happened but recognizing from the growing law enforcement presence that something serious had occurred. Curtains shifted as residents quietly watched from living room windows. Conversations began in hushed voices. Speculation spread faster than confirmed information. For investigators arriving at the scene, the first priority was straightforward but emotionally overwhelming. They needed to secure the residence, determine exactly what had occurred, and begin preserving every possible piece of evidence. Every minute mattered. Every footprint, every fingerprint, every object inside the home might eventually help explain events that, at that moment, seemed almost incomprehensible. The officers who entered the house had no way of knowing that they were stepping into the opening chapter of an investigation that would remain active for more than 3 decades. At first, they treated the crime as they would any major homicide investigation. Photographs were taken. Evidence was documented. Witnesses were identified. Neighbors were interviewed. Family members were contacted. Each step followed established investigative procedures, yet there was an unmistakable awareness among those present that this case felt different. Experienced detectives understand that every crime scene tells a story. Sometimes that story is obvious. Sometimes it remains hidden beneath details that only become meaningful weeks, months, or even years later. On that January afternoon, investigators could see fragments of a story but not the complete picture. There was no immediate explanation that connected every unanswered question. Why this family? Why this home? Was the offender someone they knew? Had the victims been specifically targeted, or was the location selected at random? Those questions would dominate the investigation from its earliest hours. Outside the house, the atmosphere grew heavier as more people learned what had happened. News traveled through Wichita in the way it often did before smartphones and social media. Telephone calls connected relatives. Friends informed co-workers. Local television and radio stations interrupted regular programming as reporters worked to verify information before broadcasting updates. Every confirmed detail seemed to raise even more uncertainty. Parents throughout the city reacted almost instinctively. Children were called inside earlier than usual. Doors that had once remained unlocked during the day were suddenly secured. People who had never considered purchasing additional locks or outdoor lighting began discussing home security with neighbors. Fear rarely appears all at once. It arrives in stages. First comes disbelief. Then caution. Finally, routine begins to change. The Otero case represented more than an individual family tragedy. It challenged deeply held assumptions about safety inside one's own home. For many Wichita residents, the family represented everything familiar about suburban life. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives. If something like this could happen to them, people quietly wondered, could it happen to anyone? Investigators faced mounting pressure almost immediately. The public demanded answers. The surviving family deserved answers. The city needed reassurance. Yet responsible investigators understood that assumptions made too early could permanently damage a case. They resisted speculation, focusing instead on physical evidence, interviews, timelines, and careful analysis. Behind closed doors, detectives began constructing the earliest version of a timeline. Who had last spoken with members of the family? Who had seen unusual activity near the neighborhood? Were there reports of suspicious vehicles? Had anyone heard anything unusual? Every answer was documented. Every inconsistency was examined. Most ultimately led nowhere. That frustration would become a defining feature of the investigation. The more detectives worked, the more they realized they were searching for someone who had left remarkably little behind to identify himself. There was no obvious suspect waiting to be questioned. No clear motive immediately revealed itself. No straightforward explanation emerged. The absence of simple answers proved deeply unsettling. As evening approached, the winter sky darkened once again over Wichita. The flashing emergency lights that had illuminated the neighborhood throughout the day gradually disappeared as investigators completed the first stage of processing the scene. Police officers remained visible in the area, while detectives carried boxes of collected evidence back to headquarters. Inside those boxes lay countless items that would be examined repeatedly over the coming months. Some would ultimately prove important. Others would become investigative dead ends. At that moment, no one could distinguish between them. The city settled uneasily into the night. Families gathered around dinner tables discussing the news they had heard throughout the day. Many parents avoided describing the details in front of young children. Others struggled to answer difficult questions that suddenly had no comforting answers. How could something like this happen? Was the neighborhood safe? Had the person responsible been caught? The honest answer was the most frightening one. No. As detectives continued working late into the evening, they remained unaware that this investigation would become one of the longest and most complex homicide cases in American history. They believed they were searching for the person responsible for an unimaginable crime against one family. They could not yet know that the offender would continue to evade capture for decades, leaving investigators to confront not only one tragedy but a pattern that had not yet fully revealed itself. The silence that settled over Wichita that night felt different from the silence of the night before. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a city ending another ordinary day. It was the silence that follows the realization that certainty has been replaced by uncertainty, that familiar streets can suddenly feel unfamiliar, and that somewhere beyond the reach of flashing police lights, the person responsible remained unknown. That single fact would linger over Wichita long after the crime scene tape was removed, long after newspaper headlines faded, and long before anyone had ever heard the three letters that would one day become synonymous with one of America's most notorious unsolved investigations, BTK. When detectives returned to the Otero residence after the initial emergency response, the atmosphere had shifted. The urgency of saving lives had given way to the painstaking work of understanding what had happened. Every room, every doorway, every object inside the home became part of a larger puzzle that investigators knew would require patience rather than assumptions. Crime scene processing in 1974 was a meticulous but fundamentally different process from what audiences might imagine today. There were no rapid DNA databases, no sophisticated digital mapping systems, and no computer algorithms capable of instantly connecting evidence across jurisdictions. Detectives relied on careful observation, handwritten notes, photography, physical evidence, and countless hours of methodical work. The first objective was simple: preserve everything before it disappeared. Investigators photographed the interior from multiple angles before anything was moved. Measurements were recorded. Sketches documented the layout of the home. Evidence technicians carefully collected fingerprints and searched for trace evidence that might identify the offender or establish a timeline. Every item was catalogued with the understanding that something seemingly insignificant could later become the key to solving the case. One of the earliest conclusions was that this was not a burglary that had gone wrong. Although investigators considered every possibility, the available evidence suggested that robbery was not the primary motive. That realization immediately changed the direction of the investigation. If financial gain had not driven the crime, then what had? Detectives began interviewing relatives, friends, neighbors, and co-workers. They reconstructed the family's recent activities hour by hour, searching for any disagreement, unusual encounter, or suspicious event that might explain why the Otero family had been targeted. The answers proved frustratingly ordinary. Friends described a close-knit family. Co-workers spoke positively of Joseph Otero. Neighbors recalled nothing that immediately stood out. There were no obvious enemies. No known disputes that appeared capable of explaining the crime. The lack of an immediate suspect became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. At the same time, officers expanded their search beyond the immediate neighborhood. Reports of suspicious vehicles, unfamiliar individuals, or unusual behavior from previous days were collected and compared. Hundreds of leads were evaluated. Most ultimately ended without producing evidence that could move the case forward. For investigators, this is often one of the least visible but most demanding aspects of homicide work. Every lead deserves attention until it can be ruled out. Even information that appears insignificant must be documented because its importance may only become apparent after additional evidence is discovered. The workload grew rapidly. Detectives found themselves reviewing interview notes late into the evening, comparing timelines, and searching for connections that refused to appear. As the days passed, the investigation expanded instead of narrowing. Meanwhile, the community watched closely. Local newspapers reported on the progress of the case while avoiding speculation whenever possible. Public concern increased as residents realized that the person responsible had not been identified. Telephone calls began arriving at police headquarters from citizens offering observations, rumors, and theories. Some tips were helpful. Many were not. Every one of them still required evaluation. The emotional pressure on investigators was immense. The surviving members of the Otero family deserved answers. The public expected reassurance. City leaders wanted confidence restored. Yet experienced detectives understood that solving a homicide could not be rushed simply because the community demanded quick results. As weeks turned into months, the investigation entered a difficult phase familiar to many major cases. Initial momentum gave way to persistent uncertainty. Evidence was re-examined. Interviews were revisited. Detectives challenged their own assumptions, asking whether they had overlooked something during the earliest days of the investigation. Despite those efforts, no clear breakthrough emerged. Looking back with the benefit of history, it is easy to wonder why the case proved so difficult. The answer lies largely in the limitations of the era. Many forensic techniques now considered standard either did not exist or were still in their infancy. DNA profiling would not become available for criminal investigations until years later. Digital record systems capable of rapidly comparing evidence across cases had not yet transformed policing. Investigators were working with the best tools available to them, but those tools had limits. What they did not yet realize was that the Otero investigation would not remain an isolated case. Over time, additional crimes would reveal similarities that suggested a single offender might be responsible. Those similarities would become increasingly important as detectives searched for patterns rather than isolated incidents. Behavioral analysis, victimology, and careful comparison between cases would gradually reshape the investigation. The realization that investigators might be pursuing a serial offender fundamentally changed the stakes. No longer was the challenge simply identifying the person responsible for one crime. The challenge became stopping someone who might strike again. That possibility weighed heavily on everyone involved. Detectives understood that every unanswered question carried consequences beyond a single investigation. Each day without an arrest increased the uncertainty facing the community and the emotional burden carried by the victims' families. Years later, many investigators would reflect on those early months with remarkable honesty. They described a case that demanded persistence, humility, and constant re-evaluation. They acknowledged the frustration of pursuing leads that ended without results and the determination required to continue despite repeated setbacks. Those first months established the foundation for everything that followed. Evidence carefully preserved in 1974 would later be revisited using technologies unavailable at the time. Interview notes would be reviewed by new generations of detectives. Files would grow into thousands of pages. The investigation itself would become a living record, passed from one team to another as years became decades. No one processing that first crime scene could have imagined that they were beginning one of the longest-running serial murder investigations in American history. Yet that is exactly what was happening. The most important clues had not yet been recognized, the offender remained unidentified, and the investigation was only beginning. The next phase would challenge detectives in an entirely new way, as additional crimes forced them to confront the possibility that the violence they had hoped was an isolated tragedy was, in fact, part of a much larger and far more complex pattern. In the months and years that followed the Otero family tragedy, investigators in Wichita faced a challenge that would test not only their skills but also their patience. The evidence suggested that the person responsible had not acted randomly, yet the path toward identifying that person remained hidden beneath layers of uncertainty. A homicide investigation often begins with a search for connection. Detectives look for relationships between the victim and the offender. They examine personal conflicts, financial motives, emotional disputes, and opportunities that might explain why one person became a target. In many cases, the answer exists somewhere within the victim's own circle of acquaintances. But the Otero investigation did not provide that simple explanation. The family had not been involved in any known conflict that pointed investigators toward a clear suspect. Friends, relatives, and neighbors were questioned. Background information was collected. Personal histories were reviewed. Detectives searched for anything that might explain why this particular household had been chosen. Instead, they found something far more difficult. Normal lives. The absence of an obvious motive created a growing sense of uncertainty. Investigators were not only searching for a person. They were trying to understand the nature of the crime itself. Was this an isolated act committed by someone who had suddenly lost control? Was the offender someone who had planned the event carefully? Was there a connection between this crime and other incidents that had not yet been recognized? At the beginning, those questions had no clear answers. The investigation moved forward through hundreds of conversations. Detectives spoke with people who had known the family, people who lived nearby, and people who might have noticed something unusual around the neighborhood. Officers followed reports of suspicious behavior and examined possible leads from the public. Most investigations are built on a foundation of elimination. A name appears. A person is questioned. Evidence is compared. A possibility becomes stronger or disappears. But in the early stages of this case, possibilities disappeared faster than they developed. Each dead end carried its own frustration. A tip that seemed promising might lead nowhere. A person of interest might have an explanation that could be verified. A theory that appeared convincing might collapse after careful examination. For detectives, this process required discipline. A serious investigation cannot be guided by fear or assumptions. The wrong accusation can damage innocent lives and destroy the credibility of a case. Every possibility must be examined carefully, even when the pressure for immediate answers becomes overwhelming. As time passed, investigators began noticing that traditional approaches were not producing the answers they needed. The offender appeared to have selected victims without an obvious personal relationship. That created a difficult problem for law enforcement. If there was no clear connection between victim and offender, then where should detectives look? The answer would eventually come from studying patterns. But patterns take time to emerge. At first, the crimes appeared as separate tragedies. Different victims. Different locations. Different circumstances. It was only after additional incidents occurred that investigators began recognizing similarities that suggested something more organized was happening. The possibility of a serial offender changed the entire direction of the investigation. A single murderer is already a difficult case. A serial offender creates a different kind of challenge. Investigators must examine not only what happened but why certain victims were chosen. They must compare locations, timelines, behaviors, and evidence. They must ask whether the offender is changing, learning, or becoming more confident. In Wichita, those questions became increasingly important as new cases emerged. The community's fear also grew. People began paying closer attention to the news. Stories about unsolved crimes created conversations among neighbors and families. Parents became more cautious. Residents looked differently at unfamiliar vehicles and strangers walking through their neighborhoods. Fear has a way of changing how people see the world. A person who once appeared ordinary might suddenly seem suspicious. A stranger standing too long near a home might become a source of concern. An unanswered question might become a rumor. For police, managing public fear became another responsibility alongside solving the crimes themselves. They needed information from the community, but they also needed to prevent panic from replacing facts. As investigators continued working, they encountered one of the most difficult realities of long-term cases: time. Time can help investigations, but it can also work against them. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Documents become harder to locate. People who once held important information may no longer be available. The passing years created a growing distance between the crimes and the possibility of resolution. Yet the case never truly disappeared. Files remained open. Evidence remained preserved. Investigators continued reviewing information whenever new opportunities emerged. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies developed new methods and technologies that would eventually transform criminal investigations. Techniques that were unavailable during the early years would later provide possibilities that previous investigators could only imagine. But during this period, the identity of the offender remained unknown. To the public, the person responsible existed almost like a shadow. A name without a face. A possibility without confirmation. And that uncertainty created one of the most disturbing aspects of the BTK case. The offender was not hiding in some distant world completely separate from society. He was living among ordinary people. He worked. He interacted with others. He maintained relationships. He appeared to be part of the same community that feared him. This contrast would become one of the central mysteries surrounding Dennis Rader. How could someone commit such crimes while maintaining the appearance of a normal life? That question would later become a major focus of psychological analysis. Experts would study the separation between his public identity and his hidden behavior, examining how some offenders construct carefully controlled versions of themselves for the outside world. But in the years when investigators were still searching, those answers were unavailable. All they had were fragments. A growing pattern. A collection of unanswered questions. And a determination to continue. The investigation entered a period defined not by dramatic breakthroughs but by persistence. Detectives followed leads, revisited evidence, and attempted to understand an offender who had left behind more questions than answers. The greatest challenge was not simply finding a suspect. It was recognizing him. Because the person investigators were searching for had already learned how to disappear into ordinary life. And for many years, that would remain his greatest advantage. For more than 3 decades, the BTK investigation existed as an open wound in Wichita. Cases like this rarely disappear completely. Even when years pass without arrests, without new headlines, and without public updates, the files remain. Names remain. Questions remain. For the investigators who carried the case forward, the absence of an answer was never the same as acceptance. A cold case is not a closed case. It is a promise that somewhere, hidden among old reports, preserved evidence, forgotten conversations, or newly available technology, there may still be a path forward. By the early 2000s, the world had changed dramatically from the one that existed when the first BTK crimes occurred. The city of Wichita had changed. Law enforcement had changed. Technology had changed. But one thing remained unchanged: the identity of the person responsible was still unknown. For many years, Dennis Rader appeared to have disappeared completely from the investigation. After the early 1990s, the crimes connected to BTK stopped. Whether he truly stopped committing crimes or whether additional offenses remained undiscovered was a question investigators could not answer. The silence created uncertainty. Some believed the offender might have died. Others wondered if he had moved away. Some investigators considered the possibility that he had simply chosen to stop. But one possibility remained difficult to ignore. Perhaps he was still watching. Perhaps he was still interested in the case. Perhaps the need for recognition had never disappeared. That final possibility would prove to be the most important. In 2004, as the anniversary of the first BTK crimes approached, renewed media attention brought the case back into public conversation. News organizations revisited one of Wichita's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The name BTK, once associated with fear and unanswered questions, began appearing again in newspapers and broadcasts. And then something unexpected happened. The person investigators had been searching for decades decided to communicate. The return of BTK created a situation unlike many previous investigations. Usually, detectives work with whatever evidence an offender unknowingly leaves behind. They attempt to reconstruct events from traces, witnesses, and mistakes. Here, the offender chose to insert himself into the investigation. He sent messages. He wanted his crimes remembered. He wanted control over the story. For investigators, this presented both an opportunity and a challenge. Every communication could contain information. Every message could reveal something about the writer. Every mistake could create a path toward identification. But investigators also understood that they were dealing with someone who wanted attention. They needed to balance the desire to gather information with the need to avoid giving him exactly what he sought. The investigation became a psychological exchange. The person sending messages believed he was directing the conversation. Law enforcement believed patience would eventually reveal what he was trying to hide. Behind the scenes, detectives carefully analyzed every communication. They examined language, timing, writing style, and the details included by the sender. Experts understood that people often reveal more about themselves than they realize, especially when they believe they are demonstrating intelligence or superiority. Confidence can become a weakness. A person trying to prove control often creates opportunities for others to observe them. The BTK communications gradually provided investigators with new information. They confirmed that the offender was alive. They suggested that he remained interested in the attention surrounding the case. Most importantly, they created a new investigative pathway after years of silence. The case was no longer frozen in the past. It was active again. Investigators now had something they had not possessed for years: direct contact. But the greatest breakthrough would come from something much smaller. Something that, at the time, seemed almost insignificant. A piece of technology. By 2005, computers had become common tools in workplaces, churches, and homes. Digital information had become part of everyday life, but many people still did not fully understand how much information electronic devices could retain. The sender of BTK communications believed he had found a way to communicate while protecting his identity. But digital traces are often more persistent than people expect. Information can remain hidden long after someone believes it has been removed. Investigators carefully examined the materials connected to the communications. Their work required combining traditional detective methods with emerging digital forensic techniques. The case that had once depended on fingerprints, interviews, and physical evidence was now entering a new era. The smallest technical detail could become as important as any physical clue. Eventually, investigators identified information that pointed them toward Dennis Rader. The name was surprising to many who knew him. He was not an unknown outsider living on the margins of society. He was someone who had maintained a recognizable presence in his community. He had worked. He had attended church. He had participated in local activities. He had built the kind of ordinary public identity that made the revelation difficult for many people to accept. For those who knew him, the news created a disturbing conflict between memory and reality. How could the person they recognized be connected to something so horrifying? That question would be repeated many times after his arrest. Investigators, however, understood that suspicion was not enough. They needed evidence. The decades-long investigation had taught them patience. They had waited years for answers, and they would not allow the final stage to be weakened by rushing forward without confirmation. Evidence was collected. Information was verified. Connections were examined carefully. The investigation that had begun with uncertainty in 1974 was now moving toward a conclusion. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. The moment represented a dramatic turning point in one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations. For Wichita, it ended decades of uncertainty. For investigators, It marked the completion of a pursuit that had lasted through changing generations of law enforcement. But the arrest did not erase the past. It did not return the lives that had been lost. It did not remove the grief carried by families for more than 30 years. Justice could answer some questions. It could not undo the damage. Following his arrest, investigators began the process of confronting the full scope of the case. Rader admitted responsibility for the 10 confirmed murders connected to BTK. His statements provided details about the crimes and confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that the same person had been responsible for a series of attacks spanning many years. The confession brought resolution to the investigation. But it also brought a deeper understanding of the person behind the crimes. For decades, Dennis Rader had existed between two identities. The man known by neighbors. And the man hidden from the world. The contrast between those identities became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. It challenged assumptions about what danger looks like and reminded investigators that appearances can conceal realities that remain invisible for years. The breakthrough in the BTK case was not the result of a single moment of luck. It was the result of persistence across generations. Detectives who refused to abandon the investigation. Evidence preserved despite the passing of time. Technology that created new possibilities. And an offender whose desire to be recognized ultimately contributed to his own exposure. After more than 30 years, the search was over. The mystery had a name. The investigation had reached its final chapter. But for the families of the victims, the story was never only about finding the person responsible. It was about remembering the people whose lives had been taken. And that would become the focus of the next stage, the courtroom, where justice would finally confront Dennis Rader and where the voices of the victims' families would stand at the center of the case. For the people of Wichita, the arrest of Dennis Rader brought an answer that many had waited more than 30 years to receive. But an arrest is not the end of a case. It is the beginning of another search. The search for truth. The search for accountability. And ultimately, the search for justice. When Dennis Rader was taken into custody in February 2005, the city that had carried the weight of the BTK mystery for decades was forced to confront a reality that many found difficult to accept. The man accused of being one of America's most notorious serial killers was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was someone who had lived among them, maintained a public identity, and moved through ordinary life while carrying a secret that had remained hidden for years. The shock was not only about what had happened. It was about who had been responsible. As investigators continued building their case, the focus shifted from the mystery of the unknown offender to the evidence that would determine his fate. Every piece of information collected over the years, every communication, every investigative discovery, and every preserved record now became part of the legal process. The courtroom would become the place where the story of BTK was examined under the demands of justice. In June 2005, Dennis Rader appeared in court and entered a guilty plea to 10 counts of first-degree murder. The decision surprised some observers because many high-profile criminal cases involve lengthy legal battles, challenges to evidence, or attempts to avoid responsibility. Rader, however, chose to admit guilt. His courtroom appearance was closely watched. For years, he had attempted to control the narrative surrounding his crimes. Through letters and messages, he had tried to shape how people viewed him. In court, however, the focus was no longer on the identity he had created for himself. The focus was on the victims, the families, and the consequences of his actions. During the proceedings, Rader acknowledged responsibility for the murders. His calm manner drew significant attention because it contrasted sharply with the pain carried by those who had waited years for justice. For many observers, the emotional distance displayed in the courtroom became another reminder of the divide between the public image he had maintained and the reality of the crimes he had committed. But the courtroom was not only a place where facts were presented. It was also a place where families finally had the opportunity to speak. For decades, many relatives of the victims had lived with unanswered questions. They had experienced birthdays without loved ones, holidays marked by absence, and anniversaries that carried memories of loss. No verdict could restore what had been taken from them, but the legal process provided a moment when their voices could be heard. Victim impact statements transformed the case from a story about an offender into a reminder of the human beings behind the headlines. They spoke about parents who were missed, children whose futures had been stolen, family members whose absence was felt every day. They reminded the court that these were not simply names in an investigation file. They were people with personalities, relationships, dreams, and lives that mattered. That distinction was important. For years, the public conversation surrounding BTK had often centered on the mystery of the killer. The investigation, the search, and the eventual capture had attracted enormous attention. But the courtroom shifted that focus back toward the people who had suffered the greatest loss. The victims were no longer only connected to a crime. They were remembered as individuals. The sentencing phase carried a different emotional weight from the investigation. Detectives had spent years searching for answers. Prosecutors had spent months preparing evidence. But for families, the moment represented something far more personal. It was a moment of acknowledgement. A recognition that what happened to their loved ones was not forgotten. In August 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Because the crimes occurred before Kansas reinstated the death penalty, the maximum punishment available under state law was life imprisonment. The sentence ensured that Rader would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The legal conclusion brought an end to the formal investigation. But justice does not always feel like closure. Closure suggests something has been completed and left behind. For many victims' families, grief does not work that way. A conviction can provide accountability. It can confirm the truth. It can prevent an offender from causing further harm. But it cannot erase memories of the people who were lost. It cannot return decades that families spent waiting for answers. It cannot restore futures that disappeared. The sentencing of Dennis Rader also created an opportunity for society to examine the larger questions surrounding the case. How had someone maintained such an ordinary public life while committing extraordinary crimes? How had investigators eventually uncovered a person who had remained hidden for so long? What lessons could be learned from the investigation? The BTK case became an important example of how law enforcement had evolved over time. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining long-term investigations, and adapting to new technology. The case also showed the power and danger of attention. Dennis Rader wanted recognition. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted control over the story. Ultimately, that desire contributed to his downfall. The same need that pushed him to communicate with investigators created the opportunity for them to identify him. His attempt to become unforgettable ensured that he would never again disappear into ordinary life. But the final chapter of the case was never meant to belong to him. History often remembers criminals because their actions are shocking. Their names become familiar. Their crimes become studied. Yet every investigation begins with people whose lives existed before the crime. The Otero family. Catherine Bright. Shirley Vian. Nancy Fox. Maureen Hedge. Vicky Weigel. Dolores Davis. They were not defined by how they died. They were defined by how they lived. The justice system had reached its conclusion. The courtroom had delivered its sentence. The search was over. But memory continued. For Wichita, the BTK case became a permanent reminder of both the vulnerability and resilience of communities. It revealed how fear can change the way people view the world, but it also showed the determination of families, investigators, and citizens who refused to allow uncertainty to erase the truth. More than 30 years after the first crime, the mystery had finally been solved. The name behind the initials had been revealed. Dennis Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. But the people whose lives were taken would continue to be remembered for something greater than the tragedy that surrounded them. They would be remembered as human beings. And that is where the true meaning of justice begins. More than 3 decades after the first crime shocked Wichita, the search for the person behind the name BTK had finally ended. The investigation that began with uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions had reached its conclusion. The man who had remained unidentified for so many years had a name, a face, and a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. But for everyone connected to this case, the ending was far more complicated than a courtroom decision. Because some stories do not truly end when the verdict is delivered. Some wounds continue long after the headlines disappear. The city of Wichita had changed in the years between the first crime and the arrest of Dennis Rader. Neighborhoods expanded. Technology transformed daily life. Entire generations grew up knowing the BTK case as part of their city's history rather than as a current threat. Children who had once heard warnings from their parents became adults. Some became parents themselves. They inherited stories about a time when fear had moved quietly through familiar streets, when neighbors questioned whether the person responsible might be someone they passed every day. The arrest brought relief. But relief is not the same as forgetting. For many residents, the BTK case remained a reminder of how deeply one person's actions could affect an entire community. The crimes were committed against specific individuals and families, but the fear extended beyond those homes. It entered conversations between neighbors. It changed how people thought about safety. It altered the feeling of a city that had once trusted its familiarity. Communities often measure tragedies not only by what happened, but by what changed afterward. In Wichita, people became more aware of personal safety. Law enforcement agencies examined the investigation for lessons that could improve future cases. The importance of communication between departments, careful evidence preservation, and the willingness to revisit old information became clearer. The BTK investigation demonstrated something important about time. Time can weaken memories. Time can create distance. But time can also provide answers. Evidence that once seemed limited could become valuable when new technology emerged. Information that appeared insignificant decades earlier could gain meaning when viewed through a different perspective. The case became an example of how modern investigations are often built across generations. The detectives who began the search were not necessarily the same people who completed it. Some retired. Some moved on. Some never saw the final result. But their work remained. Every interview. Every report. Every piece of evidence preserved instead of discarded. Every unanswered question recorded instead of forgotten. A successful investigation is rarely the achievement of one person. It is often the result of many people continuing a responsibility that began long before they arrived. The BTK case also changed the way many people thought about criminal investigations in the digital age. Dennis Rader was ultimately identified not because of a dramatic confrontation or a sudden confession in an interrogation room. The breakthrough came through the combination of traditional police work and emerging technology. The case showed that the modern world leaves traces. A person can believe they are anonymous while still creating evidence. A message can reveal more than intended. A simple mistake can become the connection investigators have been searching for. Technology did not replace detective work. It strengthened it. Human judgment, patience, and careful analysis remained essential. But the case also raised difficult questions about identity and deception. One of the most unsettling aspects of Dennis Rader's story was the contrast between the person many people believed they knew and the person revealed through the investigation. To acquaintances, he appeared to be a regular member of society. He had a job. He had family responsibilities. He participated in community activities. He maintained relationships. The revelation forced many people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Danger does not always look dangerous. A person's public image does not always reveal their private actions. This does not mean that suspicion should replace trust or that ordinary behavior should automatically be viewed with fear. Rather, the case demonstrated the complexity of human behavior and the challenges faced by those trying to understand individuals who commit extreme crimes. Psychologists studying offenders like Rader have examined themes such as control, attention-seeking, fantasy, and the creation of false identities. However, there is rarely one simple explanation for why someone commits such acts. Human behavior is complicated. Criminal acts are shaped by multiple factors. Understanding those factors does not excuse responsibility. It helps society recognize warning signs, improve prevention efforts, and develop better responses to future threats. Perhaps the most important lesson from the BTK case is also the easiest to overlook. The story should never belong only to the person who committed the crimes. Serial offenders often seek exactly what their victims lose: attention, recognition, and a place in history. But remembering the offender while forgetting the victims creates an incomplete picture. The true center of this story has always been the people whose lives were interrupted. Joseph Otero was more than a victim in a criminal case. He was a father. Julie Otero was more than a name in an investigation file. She was a mother. Joseph Jr. and Josephine were more than children whose lives ended too soon. They were young people with futures that should have continued. Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Weigel, and Dolores Davis were not simply connected by the person who harmed them. They each had their own histories, their own relationships, their own memories, their own places in the lives of people who loved them. That is the part of the story that deserves to survive. Not the mythology surrounding a killer. Not the fascination with a criminal identity. But the reminder that behind every case file are real people. Real families. Real losses. Years after the arrest and conviction, the BTK case continues to be studied by investigators, criminologists, and the public. It remains one of America's most recognized serial murder investigations because of its unusual combination of longevity, deception, technology, and psychological complexity. But the ultimate meaning of the case is not found only in how the investigation ended. It is found in what the investigation revealed. It revealed the importance of persistence. It revealed the value of protecting evidence even when answers seem impossible. It revealed that communities can survive fear without allowing fear to define them. And it revealed that justice, while unable to change the past, can still provide truth. The streets of Wichita that once carried uncertainty eventually returned to ordinary life. Children grew up. Families created new memories. Neighborhoods continued forward. The city did not erase what happened. Instead, it carried the memory. Because remembering is part of justice. The story of BTK is ultimately not just the story of a man who spent decades hiding behind a carefully created image. It is the story of the people who endured loss. The investigators who refused to give up. The families who carried grief with strength. And a community that learned that even after the darkest chapters, life continues. History will remember the name Dennis Rader. But history must also remember the names that existed before his. Because the measure of a tragedy should never be the fame of the person who caused it. It should be the value of the lives that were taken. And those lives mattered. Some cases end when a suspect is arrested. Some end when a verdict is delivered. But there are rare cases that continue to exist long after the courtroom doors close. The BTK case belongs to that category. For decades, it was not only a criminal investigation. It was a question that followed an entire community through time. It represented uncertainty, fear, and the uncomfortable realization that the person responsible for unimaginable crimes could remain hidden behind an ordinary life. When Dennis Rader was finally identified, many people expected the answer to bring complete relief. Instead, it brought something more complicated. The truth. And sometimes, the truth is difficult because it forces people to confront the fact that the world is not always as simple as they want it to be. The story of BTK became a reminder that appearances can be misleading. A person can occupy familiar spaces, interact with neighbors, and maintain a respected public image while hiding a reality that no one around them understands. That contrast became one of the most studied aspects of the case. Not because it made the offender remarkable, but because it revealed the importance of looking beyond assumptions. Investigators, psychologists, and criminal justice professionals examined the case to understand how long-term offenders maintain separation between their public and private identities. The lessons were not about identifying a specific type of person, because there is no simple appearance or personality that predicts criminal behavior. Instead, the case highlighted the importance of evidence, patterns, and careful investigation. Facts matter more than impressions. Proof matters more than appearances. That principle guided the investigation from beginning to end. The BTK case also demonstrated how dramatically criminal investigations can change over time. In 1974, detectives worked with tools available in that era. They relied on interviews, physical evidence, observation, and traditional investigative methods. By 2005, investigators had access to technology that previous generations could not have imagined. The case existed across two different worlds. One began with handwritten reports and physical files. The other included digital information and advanced forensic analysis. The investigation became a bridge between those eras, showing how law enforcement evolves while maintaining the same fundamental purpose: finding the truth. But technology alone did not solve the case. Behind every discovery were people. Detectives who reviewed old information. Analysts who examined details carefully. Investigators who remained willing to question previous assumptions. The ability to solve a decades-old case came not from one single breakthrough, but from years of commitment. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside the investigation. Major cases are rarely solved by one dramatic moment. They are solved through persistence. Through patience. Through people continuing the work even when answers seem distant. Yet beyond the investigation and the offender, the most lasting legacy of the BTK case belongs to the victims and their families. Time does not erase loss. A conviction does not restore what was taken. A prison sentence does not return birthdays, conversations, holidays, or ordinary moments that families should have experienced together. For those left behind, justice is not the end of grief. It is simply the recognition that the truth has finally been acknowledged. The families connected to this case carried something that no courtroom could fully measure. They carried memories. They carried photographs. They carried stories of people who existed long before their names appeared in newspapers. That is why remembering victims is essential. Because tragedy can sometimes reduce human beings into statistics. A number. A date. A headline. But every victim had a complete life. Every victim had people who loved them. Every victim had dreams that mattered. The greatest responsibility in telling stories like this is ensuring that the person responsible does not become larger than the people who suffered. Criminals may create fear. They may attract attention. They may become subjects of documentaries and investigations. But their actions should never erase the humanity of their victims. The final lesson of the BTK case is not only about crime. It is about memory. It is about how societies choose to remember difficult chapters in their history. Do they remember only the person who caused harm? Or do they remember the lives, families, and communities affected by that harm? The answer determines what lessons survive. Today, the case remains a subject of study because it represents many different aspects of criminal justice: long-term investigations, forensic development, behavioral analysis, and the relationship between technology and law enforcement. But beneath all of those subjects is a simpler truth. Real people lived this story. Real people lost loved ones. Real people spent years waiting for answers. The investigation eventually found the person responsible. Justice was delivered. But the most meaningful part of the story was never the identity of the killer. It was the reminder that every name in a case file represents a life that mattered. And long after the headlines disappear, that is what remains. Not the fear. Not the mystery. Not the initials. The people. The memories. And the responsibility to never forget them. Years after Dennis Rader's arrest, the name BTK continued to appear in discussions about criminal investigations, psychology, and the challenges of understanding violent offenders. But as time passed, another question became increasingly important. When a case finally ends, what remains? For law enforcement, the answer exists in lessons learned. For researchers, it exists in analysis. For communities, it exists in memory. And for families who lost loved ones, it exists in the quiet moments that continue long after the public attention disappears. The world often remembers major criminal cases through their most dramatic moments: the investigation, the discovery of a suspect, the courtroom proceedings, and the final verdict. But life after a case is rarely dramatic. It is quieter. It is measured in ordinary days. It is found in anniversaries, family gatherings, and moments when memories unexpectedly return. For survivors of violent loss, time does not move in a straight line. The world continues forward, but certain moments remain permanently connected to the past. A song, a photograph, a familiar place, or a remembered conversation can bring someone back to a time before everything changed. That is the reality behind many long-term criminal cases. The investigation may end. The grief does not follow the same timeline. The BTK case also changed how many people viewed the relationship between communities and law enforcement. When a dangerous offender remains unidentified for years, trust can become complicated. Residents want answers, but investigators often cannot share information while protecting the integrity of the case. This creates a difficult balance between public awareness and investigative responsibility. The Wichita investigation demonstrated the importance of patience. Some answers require time. Some evidence becomes meaningful only after circumstances change. Some cases remain unsolved not because investigators stop searching, but because the tools available at one moment are not enough. The eventual resolution of the case became an example of how persistence across generations can produce results. Investigators from different eras contributed to the same mission, each building upon the work of those who came before them. A detective beginning a career in the 1970s could not have predicted the technology available decades later. A modern investigator could not have reached the conclusion without the foundation created years earlier. The case became a reminder that justice is often a collective effort extending beyond individual careers. It also changed conversations about digital evidence. Before the modern era of technology, many people underestimated how much information could be preserved through electronic devices. The BTK investigation demonstrated that digital traces could become powerful investigative tools when analyzed carefully. The lesson was not simply about computers. It was about human behavior. People leave evidence behind in ways they often do not recognize. A message reveals writing habits. A document reveals information. A decision reveals personality. Every action creates a record. The investigation showed that even someone who carefully planned for years could not completely control every detail of the story they created. However, perhaps the most important legacy of the case is the reminder that crime stories should always return to the people affected. The public may remember the investigation. Researchers may examine the offender. But families remember birthdays. They remember voices. They remember personalities. They remember the people who existed before tragedy entered their lives. That is why responsible storytelling matters. A criminal case is not merely a puzzle to solve. It is a collection of human experiences. Behind every report is a person. Behind every photograph is a life. Behind every investigation file is a family waiting for answers. The BTK case became famous because of the length of time involved and the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. Yet the passage of time also revealed something else. Fame does not belong only to those who commit crimes. Communities can choose what they preserve. They can preserve fear. Or they can preserve remembrance. They can focus only on the offender. Or they can honor those who were affected. The most meaningful way to remember a case like this is not by repeating the identity of the person responsible. It is by understanding the importance of the lives that existed before him. Every victim had a story that began long before the investigation. Those stories included family traditions, personal achievements, friendships, hopes, and everyday moments that may have seemed small at the time but became priceless memories afterward. That is the human side often lost when cases become famous. A person's life cannot be measured only by the way it ended. It must be understood through everything that came before. The BTK investigation eventually reached its conclusion, but its lessons continue. It taught investigators the value of persistence. It taught communities the importance of awareness without fear. It taught society that justice requires both accountability and compassion. And it left behind a responsibility. To remember carefully. To tell stories responsibly. To ensure that the people who suffered are never reduced to background characters in someone else's crime. Because every case has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But every life has something much greater. A story. And those stories deserve to be remembered. Every major criminal investigation leaves behind more than evidence. It leaves behind questions. Some questions are answered in courtrooms. Some are examined by researchers and investigators. And some remain with society for generations, forcing people to think about safety, justice, human behavior, and the responsibility of remembering. The BTK case became one of those investigations. It was not only a story about crimes committed over many years. It was also a story about time itself. A story about how communities endure uncertainty, how investigators continue searching despite unanswered questions, and how the truth can remain hidden until circumstances finally allow it to emerge. When people look back at the case today, it is easy to focus on the unusual elements that made it famous. The decades-long search. The communications with authorities. The technological breakthrough. The eventual arrest. These moments shaped the public understanding of the investigation. But behind every major moment was a much quieter reality. Families were living with loss. Investigators were carrying unanswered questions. A community was learning how to move forward while remembering what had happened. That is the part of history that cannot be captured by headlines alone. A criminal case is often presented as a beginning and an ending. A crime occurs. An investigation begins. A suspect is identified. A verdict is reached. But for those directly affected, life does not follow such a simple timeline. There is life before the tragedy. There is the moment everything changes. And there is the long period afterward, when people must learn how to carry memories that cannot be replaced. For the families connected to the BTK case, justice was important. Truth was important. Accountability was important. But so was remembrance. Because remembering victims is not only about honoring the past. It is also about understanding what was lost. Each victim represented an entire world of relationships and experiences. They were part of families. They were part of communities. They were part of ordinary moments that mattered. A conversation at the end of a long day. A shared meal. A celebration. A simple greeting between neighbors. These moments rarely appear in official documents, yet they are often what people miss the most after someone is gone. That is why the human side of a case must never disappear beneath the weight of investigation details. The purpose of studying criminal cases is not to create fascination with those who commit terrible acts. It is to understand, prevent, and remember. The BTK investigation also demonstrated how the nature of law enforcement changes over time. When the first crimes occurred, investigators worked with limited resources compared with today's standards. They depended on experience, careful observation, and traditional detective work. Decades later, a new generation of investigators approached the same case with different tools. Technology had changed. Methods had changed. But the fundamental principles remained the same. Attention to detail. Persistence. The search for truth. The willingness to continue even when answers seemed distant. This combination of old methods and new technology became one of the defining aspects of the investigation. It showed that progress in criminal justice does not come from replacing the past. It comes from building upon it. Every report written, every interview conducted, and every piece of evidence preserved can become meaningful when future investigators have new ways to examine it. The case also became a reminder that human behavior is often more complicated than appearances suggest. For many people who knew Dennis Rader before his arrest, the revelation was difficult to process because it challenged their understanding of the person they believed they knew. This contrast between public identity and hidden behavior became a subject of discussion among psychologists and criminal justice experts. However, the lesson was not that everyone should be viewed with suspicion. The lesson was that responsible investigation must rely on evidence rather than assumptions. A person's appearance, occupation, or social reputation cannot determine guilt or innocence. Facts must do that. That principle is one of the foundations of justice. The BTK case also raised broader questions about the relationship between criminals and attention. Throughout history, some offenders have sought recognition, believing that notoriety gives them power. But attention can have an unexpected consequence. The desire to be remembered can create the very evidence that leads to exposure. The attempt to control a story can reveal the person behind it. In the end, the investigation showed that no individual can completely control how history remembers them. Dennis Rader wanted his chosen identity to survive. He wanted the initials BTK to represent his power. But the meaning of those initials changed. Instead of representing control, they became a reminder of the importance of investigation, accountability, and the lives affected by crime. The strongest legacy of the case does not belong to the person who caused harm. It belongs to those who continued searching for answers. To those who preserved memories. To those who refused to allow victims to become forgotten names. Over time, communities often face a difficult decision after tragedy. They can allow fear to define their history. Or they can allow resilience to define it. Wichita chose to continue. The city remembered what happened, but it did not remain trapped in that moment forever. People continued building lives. Families continued creating memories. New generations grew up knowing the past while still believing in the future. That is how communities heal. Not by pretending something never happened, but by acknowledging it and continuing forward. The BTK case remains a significant chapter in American criminal history because it combined mystery, technology, psychology, and decades of investigation. But the deepest lesson is simpler. Every crime story is ultimately a human story. It is about choices. It is about consequences. It is about the people left behind. And it is about the responsibility to remember those whose lives mattered long before they became part of a case file. The investigation ended. The courtroom proceedings ended. The headlines eventually faded. But memory remains. And perhaps that is the most important conclusion of all. The final chapter of a tragedy should not belong to the person who caused it. It should belong to the people who survived it. To the families who carried forward. To the investigators who searched for truth. And to the victims whose lives deserve to be remembered not because of how they were lost, but because of who they were.